It's the final week of the month. You know what that means. It's style study time. And because you guys indulged me all through this month, today I want to dive into a style that I know a lot of you guys are going to enjoy, but I've been avoiding because it is super challenging to me. Today we're looking at the super dynamic, manga-ish inspired, semi-realistic artwork of the incredible illustrator LIU, better known by his online name Artof666K. Today's video has been requested a couple of times, and sorry to the initial requesters that it's taken this long. I tend to take a long time to make these, and we only do one a month, so I do apologize. But massive thank you to Tama127, Silky Seal, and Crystals5538 for requesting this video. I really hope you guys enjoy it and that it's everything you've been looking for. If this is your very first style study, hi, welcome. My name is Srish, and I'm so glad you're here because today we're going to level up your art by like 1,000,000%. Style Study is a regular series we do here on my channel where we take a look at some of our favorite contemporary artists, analyze their work, and see what we can learn from it. Keyword, learn. We're not here to plagiarize anyone's work or copy their style, we're only here to learn some really cool art tips and tricks and see how we can apply them to finding our own unique art style. I usually structure my style studies in 3 parts. In part 1, we'll take a look at Khan's work, analyze his style, and see what we can learn from it. Part 2 will be a study of one of his original paintings. The adorable reference I've chosen today is this one. And in part 3, we'll apply everything that we learned today to an original painting of our own. Of course, if you enjoyed this video and learned something today, please do remember to like and subscribe. Comment below your biggest takeaway from this study and come say hello on Instagram and Discord. Links are down in the description below. Alrighty, if you're ready, grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive into another style study featuring Artof666K. LIU is an illustrator and concept artist from China. I believe he currently lives in Singapore, or he's from Singapore and lives in China, I'm not sure. Anyway, he is currently a principal illustration art lead at Riot Games, though he has previously worked with Blizzard, Games Workshop, Silver Goat Media, and has also featured on 3D Total Publishing. Khan's beautiful art has garnered him over 281,000 followers on Instagram and over 345,000 followers on Twitter. I would describe Khan's work as almost semi-realistic illustrations with heavy manga influence, but certainly very stylized. I say almost semi-realistic because there is still a flat 2D quality to the rendering, but it's not quite as flat as, say, proper manga. He generally paints entire narrative scenes, lots of storytelling, and just beautiful bright ambience. My favorite part of his work is just how many of these scenes are outdoors among the grass and the mountains and the beautiful open sky, or hey, even a giant wave in the ocean. Khan's art in general is very naturalist. Speaking of list, here are 4 key characteristics to LIU's art. More often than not, Khan's illustrations are set in broad daylight. There's lots of this beautiful warm sunlight that hits the characters directly, and the gorgeous blue skies that create cooler midtones and shadows. However, what really interests me is that with the way Khan paints lighting, you do get drama, but it's not like drama. So even though there are very bright key lights and ambient lights, it doesn't make everything look super flat at all, but rather there are some really nice shadows that create a sense of dynamic movement in the scene. I think the reason it looks dramatic without being dramatic is because of the actual values of the shadows as compared to the highlights. First off, you've probably noticed that there is often a very strong hard-edged key light that hits the character from either directly or diagonally above. In fact, these direct highlights are so strong and hard-edged that you can pretty much tell what time of day it is just by where they are placed. So with something like this, where the light only hits the upper planes of her head and arm, that is definitely midday where the sun is directly overhead. Here, with the sun hitting the tops and the sides of this character, this is perhaps earlier in the day, whereas here, with the sun only hitting the sides of these characters, this is inching closer to sunset. Of course, this system only applies to outdoor scenes, but you get the point. But back to the shadows, they are often very hard-edged right next to the hot spots of highlight, which is a huge reason why they appear so dramatic. It is that lack of transitional midtone that really pushes them to look so intense. But when you realistically look at the values in isolation, you see that actually these are some very pale tones for a shadow. In fact, let me prove it to you. Here's a character with a sharp highlight to shadow edge on her hand. That looks super dramatic. But then you look at her face and it is pretty much the same highlight and shadow tones, except there's a lot more mid-tone area between the two, and that really softens up that edge. As a result, that shadow, despite being pretty much the same value and tone as the shadows of the hand, ends up looking way softer, way more like mid-tone in the face. That's what I mean by it being drama, but not drama. It's about the edge of the shadow, not the value of it. Let's talk about the proportions, because while you might look at Khan's characters and say, aha, classic manga proportions, there's actually a good bit of nuance there that we can easily overlook, but that makes it very unique. First, of course, the eyes are the largest feature on the head, but unlike with most manga, Khan doesn't actually place them super low on the head. They tend to be high enough up that these characters don't look like actual children. Unless, of course, they are literal children, so that's a fun note to keep in mind when aging your characters. The shape of the eyes, though, is what stumped me most while doing the study, because while they generally look big and round, the actual shape around the eyes is rather angular with short lines rather than rounded curves. Like in this sketch, the eye looks quite large, and while the iris is round, the lash lines are actually made of consecutive straight lines. But my theory is that the reason the eyes still look so round is actually because the upper and lower lash lines don't actually meet at the inner corner. There is always an empty space there, and in the colored pieces, the whites of the eye tend to kind of flatten out in the inner corner rather than ending in a point. I think that kind of detail gives you the feeling of round eyes while also keeping everything sharp and angular. The nose and mouth are often super minimized and placed much lower on the head, leaving a lot of flat space around the eyes. When the characters are facing head-on, the nose is often indicated with just a single line, and unless the mouth is open or emoting in some way, it is also indicated by just a line of separation between the lips. Unless, of course, the character is supposed to look conventionally pretty, because then you might see a very gentle indication of the lips. There's usually a soft jaw and rounded chin, and Khan actually paints pointy elf ears a lot, which again really enhances the dynamism. When it comes to the bodies, Khan tends to often conventionally idealize them, so the feminine bodies are often thin with visible but not super extreme curves, and the masculine bodies tend to be muscular and broader. But of course you will sometimes see a muscular female fighter type character, which we all love and some of us wish we could be like, but you know, it's rare. So, as I said, a lot of the rendering in Khan's work involves flat shapes, though at first glance a lot of the skin looks super smooth. Like here, her cheek and jaw look so softly blended, but it's only when we zoom in that we see some very clearly visible hard edges. It is actually the low contrast between values and hues in skin tones that are next to each other that simulates soft blending. You'll see a similar effect with the hair, but just on a larger, flatter scale. So here, for instance, the hair is pretty much just made of 3 or 4 values, but because the value contrast is quite low and the highlight and shadow shapes are very large, the hair ends up looking smooth and straight. The one place you will see lots of high contrast edges is in the folds of the fabric. In fact, Khan tends to use literally like 3 colors and flat triangular shapes to indicate the major folds in most fabric. Like here, there's 3, maybe 4 colors that lie on the fold, with pretty much no blending whatsoever. Same here, see how the illusion of folds is created by just the shape language rather than a ton of shading and such? In fact, you'll see that Khan also throws in some of that low contrast trick like we saw in the skin into areas of highlight in the clothing. So low contrast shapes next to each other where the light hits in order to make those areas look smooth and blended without actually being smooth or blended. A subtler aspect of contrast in these paintings is actually the color temperature. And this is especially useful when you look at how he paints skin again. Like we saw, a lot of the lighting Khan paints tends to be broad daylight with a warm key light. However, a lot of the characters are actually in shadow, and while the shadows aren't super dark, they stand out sharply against the highlight. This is because the shadows tend to be slightly temperature shifted away from the highlights. So when you have this warm key light creating a super bright peachy tone in the highlights, you see a more red, purple shifted, desaturated shadow next to it to really drive up that contrast. Maybe you don't think it's such a big deal like I do, but I just thought the temperature play was a cool little extra detail to keep in our toolkit. So this whole time we've talked all about how dynamic Khan's art is, but a massive part of this dynamism is actually due to his compositional choices. So let's dive into that a little. First off, no matter what a character is doing in a scene, you'll see that their silhouette stands out loud and clear against the background. Very often this has to do with the value contrast. So here, for instance, these characters have very pronounced dark silhouettes that stand out against the much lighter background, while here the background is rather dark, and so he's painted the character in brighter tones to really make her stand out. Another great way in which the silhouettes are made to stand out is through blurring. This piece is a great example because although there isn't a massive value contrast between the character and the background, the blurring of the background causes the much sharper details of the character to really pop. However, the biggest, most impactful element of dynamism is actually all the leading lines and fast-paced curves. Starting with a subtler comp, this character is just sat here reading something. But look at all these leading lines that are at a diagonal. It takes what would otherwise be a pretty basic static scene and makes it look like it's in motion. Then we have something like this painting where these intense curves and the birds and her flying clothing all create some extreme fast-paced movement. Of course, the pose itself is incredibly dynamic, which, by the way, we could do a whole video just talking about the poses because there is just such a massive variety of how he draws characters. No matter what the scene may be, the characters are always doing something, always engaged in some way. It could range from something as simple as fixing their glasses to something crazy like actually jumping away from a giant wave. There's also a lot of dynamic perspective at play in his paintings, like here with this top-down view, which makes this simple standing pose look a lot more dynamic than it really is, or this bottom-up view that creates almost a sense of heroism with this character. And of course, there's always the dynamic elements of nature, such as water, fire, and wind, the latter of which he indicates with floating bits of leaf and dust and such. Fire, wind, and water are elements in our world that are constantly in motion, and so when we see them in a painting, we cannot automatically imagine exactly how they might move in that scene, despite it being a static, two-dimensional image. It's all incredibly fast-paced, and that, to me, is what makes Khan's work so deeply engaging. So, to sum up part 1 of this study, here are 4 key characteristics to Khan Liu's work. Number 1, Khan often paints bright daylight with shadows that look super dramatic, but without being too dark or high contrast. 2. The proportions are inspired by manga, but the eyes are higher up on the head and the bodies seem fairly realistic, if a little bit idealized. 3. The rendering is made mostly of flat shapes where Khan uses the value and temperature of adjacent colors to create the illusion of soft blending, or alternatively, very hard edges. And number 4, there are several aspects to his work that create a lot of dynamic movement in the composition, including a strong silhouette, loads of leading lines, very dynamic poses, and fast-moving elements of nature. For our study today, this is the adorable reference I've chosen. As always, I feel like it exemplifies all of the points that we looked at in part 1 and was also just really cute. So as always, I started by drawing in the outer landmarks just to orient myself on the canvas, then went in with a super rough sketch. As you can tell, she is nowhere near well placed yet, but that's okay because we're painting digitally and we can always reposition her as we go along. I then lowered the opacity and zoomed in. It's time to work on the actual shapes. This was actually where I realized just how angular the lines around the eyes are, as opposed to being rounded like you would expect them to be. I also didn't realize just how many small little shapes there are in the fabric, just because it looks so smoothly blended at a distance. But I went in and marked the most visible folds in the clothing, and then this is where we had a massive power outage, so I lost about 20 minutes of footage where I color matched the green grass and such. But anyway, after also color matching the shadow tone in the skin, I just used a simple opaque brush to block her entire body in. I then went about color matching the rest of the scene, most of which is also footage I lost, but you know, power outages have been getting a little crazy here lately. But anyway, once we have everything blocked in, it's time to look at the rendering. I started by hitting the brightest, flattest areas of key light on her skin, and that actually gave me some much needed perspective on the rest of the colors, because it kind of gave me a frame of reference. Because now that we have the brightest and darkest tones, we know that everything else must fall within those limits. What did surprise me though, was just how bright the quote shadow area of her face was. Having started with the bounce light hitting the eye socket, I realized that the values around them really aren't as dark as I blocked in, despite color matching the darkest tone that I found. It almost feels like an illusion, like that bright is so bright, it tricks your brain into thinking the rest of it is super dark. Am I rambling on about this? I'm so sorry you guys, it just really took me by surprise. The other thing that surprised me was how much blue and green there were in both the hair and the shadows of the folds in her top. But once we have some basic rendering in, it's time to zoom in and refine. I realized that the grass is painted much like the hair is, in that while most of the shapes are large and flat, you have some interesting textures and tiny shapes around the edges where light turns into shadow. So you'll see lots of little shapes where the grass kind of darkens around the character due to the drop shadow, and also little bits of texture within the shadow area. But for the most part, the lighter green is fairly flat, and any texture in there is low contrast. This is what gives it that soft, lush grass look without it just looking completely flat. I also noticed random little flashes of orange around the silhouette and randomly in the line work, which is like a cool little hand of the artist detail. Kind of looks like a bit of rim light or maybe even subsurface scattering if it's around the skin. All in all, a fun, adorable little study, and I really like how it turned out. Now, the original painting is interesting because, quite frankly, it's just something I wanted to get off my chest. But the story isn't important to this video, so let's just go straight into the sketch. I did put a super rough initial sketch down, and I don't know if you can tell, but like I'd initially made the eyes way too round. So while making the clean sketch on top, my focus was to try and match the shape language that Khan generally uses. I went way more angular and narrow, and do you see how big a difference it made? I wanted a much darker, more vamp noir type vibe here, just to contrast the cute sunshiny study that we did earlier. And just to get a little experimental, instead of first blocking in with color, I actually tried incremental shadow flats for this piece. I just made that term up, but here's what it means. I started by making dark grey flat shapes where I felt the very darkest shadows would be. I wanted the light to hit her from directly above, and so the darkest ambient occlusion shadows would be on the surfaces that point downwards and directly away from the light. Next, I grabbed a slightly lighter grey, still going to be a shadow tone, and went about the next lightest shadow. So that's going to be the surfaces that are slightly starting to curve upwards. Now remember, most of the skin is not going to be hit by the key light, but the shadows are not going to be too much darker than the highlight either. I lost another clip here to power outage, but I then blocked the rest of her in with a light grey and made some super abstract shapes for the background. I wanted to test the blurred background and sharp character composition for this one. Because we have all these different values on different layers, it was actually really easy to just lock transparency and block the colors in. Since the light is hitting from above, I started by creating warm pops of light on the upward facing planes of her face. I also resized her to fill up more of the canvas, because that way we can really push the perspective of her being super clear up close and the background being super blurry far in the distance. I do feel like I softened her skin out a bit too much with too many intermediate tones and didn't push the contrast enough. But I did try to paint a nice warm rim light hitting some of the edges that face downwards. After adjusting the levels and colors some more, here's the finished painting. I like her, but I don't know if I quite nailed the style here. What do you guys think? And there we have it, LIU demystified. You guys, that beautiful daylight is such art goals, like for real. But what was your biggest takeaway from this study? Are there any aspects to Khan's art that I may have missed out that you think are super important? Leave me a comment below and we can all learn from your insights as well. I've linked all of Khan's work down in the description below. Make sure you go check him out in case you haven't and show him some love for me. And of course, if you enjoyed this video and learned something today, please remember to like and subscribe, and that way you can show me some love as well. Thank you so much again to Tama127, Silky Seal, and Crystals5538 for requesting this video. I really hope you guys all enjoyed it and that it's been everything you've been looking for. Of course, you can support my work and grab exclusive content, my brush kit, and also prints every few months over on my Patreon. Link is in the cards and in the description below. And are there any other artists you'd like to see a style study on in the future? First, check out my style study playlist in the outro in just a second. It will show up here. I've done a ton of these already. Chances are I've probably covered some of your faves on the series before. But if I haven't, feel free to leave me a comment down below or come tell me on my Discord server and I'll add your artists to my ever-growing list. But the list is long. You guys, please be patient with me. Alrighty, you guys, that's about everything I have to say for today's video. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Check out some more style studies down here and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!